Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final part of the four-part series which cover the AimChess Rapid Finals tournament played between Magnus Carlsen and Wesley. So, the goal of these videos is to be as informative as possible about each and every move so that we can learn and retain information from some of the best players in the world. The time format for this game is 15 minutes with 3-second increment on each move. Wesley is playing white pieces and Magnus is playing the black pieces. Wesley opens up with the move c4, the English opening. But as we navigate through the opening, we can see that we quickly transpose into a sort of Queen's Gambit decline Tarrasch variation with the move c5. c5 is very popular in any Queen's Gambit, Catalan, or d4 opening, or even Carl Connor, the French, where there are pawns on e6 and d5. And the point is that you're trying to disrupt white's center. Magnus Carlsen plays a6. The point is to prevent any b5 jumps and also to set up b5 himself. This is also just a waiting move. It's more of a prophylactic move than anything. Wesley captures this d-pawn. This is very typical in the Tarrasch variation because if black tries to create an isolated pawn for white will try to do the same. And white plays g3. Magnus decides to close down this pawn structure. Alternatively, he could have played, for example, knight e6 and then tried to isolate this pawn for white. But this is a better move because now this pawn structure is closed. And now even though d5 becomes a target, it's very difficult to access. For example, this knight capture is currently impossible. And for this pawn to be captured, there needs to be an additional attacker. Let's say the bishop on g2. However, there is also the move bishop b4, which will then be able to capture this knight. And basically punishing this backward pawn is going to be very difficult for white in this case. This is exactly what happened. So Magnus plays bishop b4 after Wesley plays bishop b2. It's a very standard development. And Wesley jumps the knight into e5. The point of the knight on e5 is that it's just a very strong knight. It observes all these squares, but it also sets up this c capture at any moment. And it also opens up the bishop. Rook e8 is played and bishop d2 is played. The point of bishop d2 is that now these rooks are able to connect. As soon as this queen moves out, this bishop doesn't have any other good developing squares. And obviously b3 is not possible because this knight would be hanging. Knight c6, challenging this knight on e5. Obviously, black wants to get rid of this knight since it's white's strongest piece. We get a3, taking this bishop out. Currently, this capture is not possible because if that were to happen, he takes e5 would occur, and now two pieces are being attacked by pawns. This bishop can capture this knight. Bishop will recapture on c3. Now this knight is forced to move. Anywhere it moves, this pawn hangs since the bishop and the queen both attack this pawn. There is the opportunity to jump in with the move knight e4. But after bishop d4, this pawn structure is super solid and then queen c2 is coming, after which this bishop would capture this knight and white would be up a pawn. Obviously, this does not happen, so Magnus Carlsen retreats and we get b4. Here, Magnus Carlsen plays the very exciting en passant. After which we get a knight capture on c6 because otherwise the knight capture on e5 was possible and white would end up losing a pawn. And Wesley recaptures on b3. So we've moved on to the middle game. Let's discuss plans for both players. So for white, this is a backwards pawn and it's an isolated c-pawn. White wants to target this c-pawn by placing the rooks on c1, b1, controlling this b-file, attacking this pawn, and potentially placing the knight on a4 and c5 in the future. Ideally, white would want to get rid of the bishop on g2 because right now it's serving in absolutely nothing. So white would want to either move it or trade it off. Additionally, the bishop on d2 is very passive, so white does not mind the trading piece at all because white would be better in an endgame where there's a backwards pawn on c6 since it would become a very big target and it would force black to spend all of his resources protecting it. Black's ideas are vastly different. Black wants to start a kingside attack by pushing these pawns. Black wants to develop his pieces, place a queen on f6, g5, move this knight out, and black wants to avoid trading as many pieces as possible because, once again, if black trades off pieces, black will be worse in an endgame because when there are little pieces left on the board, it's impossible to create some sort of devastating attack, and the pawn structure is what's going to be dictating the rest of the game. So black's best bet is to create counterplay on the king side and avoid trading pieces. We get h5. Now, h5, you might be thinking, well, you are technically attacking the king side, but isn't this a weakening move? And while that is true, how do you plan on attacking the king? All of Wesley's pieces are on the queen side. This bishop definitely isn't going to just come out and magically attack white's king. And even though the pawn on h5, there aren't some sort of inherent weaknesses which are easy to target. Queen retreats to c2. This avoids the potential rook b8 attack on the queen. It also allows the queen to monitor this diagonal. And Magnus Carlsen plays h4. The point of h4 is once again to create a kingside attack. So Magnus takes up more space on the king side, tries to wedge this pawn in the enemy's camp. If this capture occurs, there are multiple plans for black. For example, knight g4 is possible, targeting this pawn. And even after h3, for example, knight h6, this pawn would be impossible to protect. There's also just the bishop c7 and then the queen d6, which attack this h2 square. Since there's no longer a pawn on g3, which is reinforced by two pawns, this is very weak and very bad. If white were to play this, white doesn't and plays rook f to c1, which is a good move. It doubles down on this file and it adds additional pressure. And finally, we get h3 from Magnus, taking as much space as possible and wedging a pawn in this camp making it very difficult for white to navigate the king side now. Bishop h1 is played, and bishop g4 comes out. Knight b1, white wants to trade off as many pieces as possible to prevent black from getting any sort of counterplay. And also, if this bishop trade was to occur, the knight on d2 is a little bit better than it is on c3. Since on c3, it doesn't have any prospects of jumping into b5 or e4, but on d2, it can maneuver itself to b3 and then place itself on the very nice c5 outpost square. Therefore, Wesley So would be very happy with a bishop trade here. Magnus refuses the trade and puts the bishop on a nice square. Here you might notice that this pawn is hanging. In fact, 2 pieces attack it and no pieces defend it, but taking this pawn would be a grave mistake. If Wesley So captured this pawn, there would be a beautiful sacrifice with bishop takes d4, and if the e-pawn recaptures, there's this rook c8 move. And what you might notice is that there's no possible way for white to protect this rook. For example, white can move anywhere else, and after this rook takes and bishop takes, this would be checkmate. If something else was played, like let's say queen takes a6, the same line is still valid, and white is forced to sacrifice his queen just to avoid checkmate. And now, obviously, this position is just terrible. I mean, queen a5, let's say a random move like bishop g5 is played. Magnus could play queen b5. If king e1, this would be mate. If king g1, then he would play queen b2, and this would attack the rook, and it would trap the rook completely. This position would be completely resignable for white. Wesley So understands that, and instead of taking the pawn, places the bishop on b4, which is the bishop's most active square. There's no general purpose for this move. There's no clear-cut outline of what this bishop's supposed to do. It just monitors this diagonal, and it allows the knight to come out to d2 and then potentially b3 and c5. We get knight e4, which is a strong move because it attacks this f2 square, so a potential queen f6 with an f2 attack is possible in the future if this queen isn't on the second file. And the knight on e4 is just strong, and it's very annoying to deal with because it attacks all of these squares. As such, Wesley So decides to trade this knight off. In result, these light squares get a lot weaker, but at least this knight is no longer on the board, and there's this rook on e4, which is a little bit misplaced. Since the rook cannot just go to f4, it has to waste some tempo to go back and potentially reroute itself. We get knight e2 attacking this rook. The rook goes back to e6. We get queen d3 is just an improving move. It also allows queen f1, which would attack these light squares, but primarily it just opens up this rook and it puts the queen on a slightly more active square. Queen f6 is played. The point of queen f6 is to eventually set up queen f3 or to double up with the rooks and attack this f2 square. Wesley So plays queen f1. Magnus Carlsen here plays just a ridiculous looking move. He plays rook back to e8. The point of the rook going back to e8 is that he pretty much acknowledges the fact that Wesley So has perfectly defended this king. However, he has forced Wesley So into a very passive position. So now that he's forced him into being very passive, he's just gonna take his attack elsewhere. Point of rook e8 is to set up rook b8, push this pawn further down, and take control of this b file. You might be asking yourself, why not just rook b8? The point is that there are some very minor differences. And with the rook going back to e8, now these rooks are connected. So, for example, there's more leniency in where he moves them since the rook wouldn't be hanging. In any case, the rooks protect each other. Second of all, this a rook also supports this e pawn, which allows the easy advancement of this pawn, which wouldn't be possible with the rook on b8. Yeah, rook b1, rook b8, and the bishop comes out, offering yet another trade. White wants this trade because if it occurs, the less pieces there are on the board, the easier it is for white to obtain an advantage in the fact that the c6 pawn is very weak. Now this rook is staring at the c6 pawn. The queen can quickly come out to d3 and then reroute itself to c3. If these rooks get traded, white is very happy in that position. Magnus does not want that, and so he places the bishop on a5, attacking this d2 knight. Wesley So persists with the idea of trading a piece, forcing Magnus to go back to c7 with the bishop, and after the bishop slides down to c3, which is a slightly odd move, but it's important to acknowledge the fact that both players are very low on time, especially Wesley So. And therefore, they're going to be playing moves less based on calculation and more based on intuition, just because there's not enough time to calculate a full line. For example, slightly better here was bishop c5 because of minor nuances, which are very difficult to understand and explain, especially when they have 1 minute left on the clock. So bishop c3 gets played, and we get a5. The point of a5 is to prevent the bishop from ever coming back to b4. And these players aren't trading rooks with each other because Magnus just doesn't want to trade at all, and Wesley So doesn't want to allow black to have the control of the file. So instead of that, we get f3. Bishop retreats to f5. We get e4, continuing to attack this bishop, trying to take more space on the king side. However, these pawns are very weak and these pieces are misplaced. Therefore, the position is really weak and it's easy to break. The bishop goes back to e6. We get e5 and queen e7. The point of queen e7 is to attack this a3 pawn. It's also to set up another c5. As we discussed earlier, very popular in any sort of queen's gambit opening or any other opening where there's a pawn on d4 and e5. c5 is almost always the idea, trying to split these pawns apart, trying to break open white's pawn structure and create some sort of isolated pawns, which can then be used as targets. Rook a1 is played, protecting this a3 pawn, and we get c5. Queen f2 and Magnus once again logs down the position, he clamps down on it. Now what we can observe is that this bishop is now worth just about as much as a pawn. For example, it cannot move backwards, it can never move to b4, it's locked behind these pawns, whereas Magnus has an active bishop pair, control over the b file, and a better pawn structure. g4, attempting to expand on the king side, trying to lock away this bishop from ever being placed on f5, and also potentially trying to play queen g3 and take this pawn. Once again, I'm going to remind you guys that these plays are both low on time, so you cannot expect the moves to be super precise. They're mostly played on intuition, but it's still worth discussing these moves because they're still very high level. f6, chipping away at this e5 pawn. Here Wesley So, I believe, did not have the time to calculate, and he wanted to save a little bit of time, so he played the move king h1. Now there is a point of king h1, and is that it removes the opportunity for this bishop to come out to b6, for example, and create a battery on the queen and king. At this moment, it wasn't dangerous because this bishop could always be played to d4 and just prevent that. However, just a safer move that prevents that from ever happening. This capture occurs, and we still get bishop b6, attacking this queen. The bishop comes out, we trade, and Magnus plays queen a7. Point of queen a7 is that if Wesley So decides to not trade, let's say he goes here, f2 is a very real possibility, and then g2 is coming with mate. Therefore, Wesley So would definitely like to avoid that. So Wesley So captures the queen, rook recaptures back. And now that we're into an endgame, what we can observe is that Magnus has two connected fast pawns that are marching down the board, and Wesley So just has a very passive position. This knight has no development squares, and it's impossible for white to defend this position. We have rook c2, and he sacrifices his pawn. Rook c8 is played. This knight cannot jump to e3 in order to protect this rook, because this knight just gets captured, and what we notice is that this bishop protects the c8 rook, so therefore this capture is also impossible. Rook c1 is played. e3, further pushing this pawn. If the rook slides over to attack this pawn, this knight would be hanging, so the rook is forced to place to c3. Magnus trades these pieces, d2, and it may seem like Magnus Carlsen just made a blunder, right? Because rook d4, and now this pawn is not able to promote, and it cannot be protected. But then there's the beautiful move, rook c7, and after the pawn captures, this is forced mate. After rook c1 check, the king cannot slide over to g2 because of the pawn on h3. So all the way back when the game first started, this h5, h4, h3 maneuver has paid its dividends. Without this pawn, this would be a draw, and actually white would probably be a little bit better. Rook d1, and Magnus Carlsen wins the championship via checkmate. Absolutely beautiful game, very well played. Now this game was primarily decided, I believe, by pawn pushes and advances, just like this h3 pawn, also the c5 pawn, and then these connected fast pawns. So if you learned just one thing from this video and absolutely nothing else, I would say that you should learn how to play with fast pawns. Super important, and it will win you so many games, even at the highest level. This concludes the AimChess Rapid Finals Tournament series. I hope you guys found this informative and entertaining. If you did, please consider checking out the video to my left. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you in a future video.